Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the circle and ellipse classes. Now, we've used circles quite a few times already in previous lessons, so we already know how it works. It has the parameters center x, center y, and radius, and the circle class defines a circle. The UML diagram is correspondingly very simple. It just has those three properties, all of which are double properties, so they can be bound to, as we've seen. And then we have the default constructor, the constructor with the specified xy, which provides the center, and the constructor with the xy and radius, which does what it sounds like. However, in Eclipse it's slightly different. It's defined by the parameters center x, center y, radius x, and radius y. The ellipse class defines an ellipse, therefore, and the reason we have a center x, center y, and a radius x and a radius y is because an ellipse doesn't have uniform length. So the distance from the center to the x-axis is going to be either less or more than the distance from the center to the y-axis. Therefore, the ellipse class is similar to the circle class in constructors and in data fields. However, the only difference is that its third constructor, that it has the center x, center y, but it also has the radius x and radius y, which specifies the specified center and radiuses. Now, with that in mind, our goal today is going to be to show a bunch of ellipses so that they almost look like a hurricane shape. So we'll have a variety of ellipses that'll be overlapping each other so that it looks like they've been laid out in front of each other with just a little bit of an edge leaning out. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to create a new, we have to make sure we import the ellipse class. And that ellipse class is stored in the scene.shape.ellipse. And with that, we can now start working. So this is actually not going to be too difficult. What we need to do here is we need to, and you can have as many iterations of this ellipse as you want. We're going to have round 16. You can have, you would create an ellipse the first time, then you specify it with a random stroke color. That's the only way you would know that you have multiple random ellipses instead of one continuous shape. Then we would set the fill color to white, and then we would rotate it every single time I multiplied by 180 divided by 16. In the same way that when we wanted to have those rotated rectangles, we did I multiplied by 180 divided by 4. In our case, we're going to do it, or in our case, we're going to be doing that with 16 instead of with 4. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a new pane. This new pane is just going to be used to store these objects. Again, it's nothing fancy, it just has to be a standard pane so it can store multiple nodes. So that pane is going to be called pane 3, and that's going to be equal to a new pane. After that, we can now create the for loop. Just like with the rectangle, in fact, it's going to be very, very similar to what we did up here. We're going to have a for loop with the integer I is initially equal to 0. Then we want this to keep going so long as I is less than 16. And then we want I to be post-incremented by 1 every time. Then we need to create a new ellipse. Now, the ellipse creation is going to be just like any other class. It's going to be called E1, and we're going to create a new ellipse with the xy of 150, comma 100. This is the center x, center y. Then our x radius, which is going to be 100, and our y radius, which is going to be 50. So this means this ellipse is going to be twice as long as it is high, or as it is height in terms of length. Then we can set the stroke color. Now this stroke color creation is going to be very, very similar to how we did it for the rectangle. In fact, we can just change the R to E1 and we can copy paste. Since what we're doing here is we're just creating a random stroke color that'll be repeated 16 times for every individual ellipse. After that, we can set the fill color to white just to make sure that we don't have a too jarring of ellipses. So we're going to say color.white, and then we can do the rotating. Now, just like with the, and I'm sorry, that was 360, not 180, but just like with the rectangle, we're going to say I multiplied by 360 180 divided by 16. In our case, we're going to be dividing by 180 since we don't want to rotate this 360 times. If we did it 360 times, then we would have too many iterations. We only need to work with 180, so we'll cut down the amount of iterations we'll have. So we're going to say e1.setRotate, and then we'll give the value of I multiplied by 180 divided by 16. Now you can actually give this, you can modify this, you can change the loop iteration. That should be equal to the number you're dividing by. But you can actually modify this program to whatever you'd like. If you wanted to have more ellipses, then all you'd have to do is change these two numbers to whatever you'd like. Either that could be 4 or it could be 100. So let's try this out. Now we have created our ellipse. All we have to do now is add this to the pane. So we're going to say pane3.getChildren .add, and then we'll add the E1 ellipse. And with that, we're actually done. The ellipse class and what we're doing here is not too complicated. All we have to do now is just show our scene. It's going to be called scene 4, and it's going to be a new scene with the pane 3 that we've created up here. And then we'll also add in the length we'd like, which is going to be 300 by 200. There's no reason for this. Again, it can be as big as you want, but because of the way we defined our circle, or our ellipse, we want it to be around 300 by 200, so that it's not like the ellipse is too small or too large, corresponding to the size of the window. Then, just like with our other cases, in fact, we can actually copy-paste this if you want to. All we have to do is make sure we add the appropriate scenes here. So we're going to say, instead of stage 3, we have to make sure we add in our new stage. So we're going to say stage, we'll call this stage 5, is equal to, or more appropriately stage 4, is equal to a new stage. And then we just correspondingly change everything that used to be stage 3 to stage 4. And then we'll change the set scene from scene 3 to scene 4. And with that, we're actually done, as long as we change the name of the screen. We'll just call it show ellipse. And with that, we're done. If we run our program, we can see this in action. So, now that it's running, you can now see what we've done. We have a variety of ellipses, each of which with a random color. However, they're always going to be white so that they're not too jarring. And they all overlap each other, so that it almost looks like they've been laid over each other. Now, if you wanted to create more of these lines, all you'd have to do is change the number in your loop continuation condition. Let's say we want to have 50, and then you would change your divisor to, for example, 50. And if we run the program now, you'll notice that we get far more corresponding lines around it. Instead, now it looks like a very tightly coiled ball. And you can keep on increasing this to the amount of times you'd like. For example, if you wanted 360, and then all we'd have to do is change this to 360. Now if we run the program again, you can see what we've done, where we now have overlapping lines, because we would have had to go into fractions, so every single time it iterates, you would have had multiple lines in the same space. So what we can do here is we can create as tightly coiled of a ball as we want, and every single time it's going to have a unique color, and it creates a very pleasing display to the eye. However, now that we've talked about ellipses, it makes sense that we'd probably want to talk about arcs, since arcs are kind of an interesting version of an ellipse. An arc is conceived as part of an ellipse, but it's defined with the parameters center x, center y, radius x, radius y, but also with the start angle and length, and an arc type. That could be arc open, arc type chord, or arc type round. Now, if you're wondering, the start angle is going to be the angle you'd like this arc to cover over. The length is going to be what it sounds like. It defines the angular extent of the arc in degrees. And the arc type, if it's open, the arc type just means that we just want the line, the outside line. That would be, if this was a circle, this would just define what part you would get. If you wanted a round, it would be as though you took in that circle, but you would also slice down to the center. So you would get the area of that area. You would get the entire area of that degrees. And if you got the chord, you would just get the appropriate secant. So you would cut off, you would get a line drawn from where your arc would be, and then you just get part of it, a very small part of it, shaded in. So let's try this out. Our goal today is going to be to show each of these. We're going to show the open, the round, the chord, and the other type of chord, where we'll fill in the chord this in the second version of that. So we're going to need to make sure we import the appropriate classes. Those appropriate classes are going to be the shape arc and the shape arc type. Now you'll see why we'll do this later on, but the reason we have to import the arc type is so that that's how we define the set type method. In the same way that you say color white, you would say arc type open. So we're going to say javafx.scene.shape.arc, and then we can actually copy paste it for the arc type. Now before we get started here, I'd like to give two quick side notes. One is that when you give your amount of degrees you'd like, that number of degrees is going to be measured in degrees, obviously. But this is correspondingly a little bit different to how it works in the other math class. In the math class, it's usually measured in radians, so keep track of this. In this case, we're always going to be working with degrees. In addition, whenever you give a negative start angle, it's going to work counterclockwise, whereas normally it'll work clockwise. And with that out of the way, we can now start creating our 4 arcs. So we're going to put this to the relative end of the program, and we're going to make sure we create a new pane. We're going to call this pane pane 5. It's going to be equal to a new pane. And now we can get started on creating our 4 arcs. Now these 4 arcs are going to be created in a fairly similar style. Keep in mind that the default type is actually not relevant here. Every single time we're going to want to set the type, and if we want to, we can set the stroke if we want to convert it from the standard color to a different color. Usually it's going to be white. And you can set the type. We're always going to set the type, and we're always going to have a label. So these arcs are actually going to be pretty similar to each other. So we're first going to create our original arc. This is going to be called arc 1, and it's equal to a new arc with the parameters. And remember, we have a variety of parameters in this case. Those are the x, y starting. Then we have our radius x, radius y. Then we have our start angle and our length. So let's get started. Our first arc is going to have the parameters of 150, comma 100, comma 80, comma 80, comma 30, comma 35. So what this says is that we want a x of 150, a y of 100, a radius x of 80, a radius y of 80, so this is actually a perfect circle, and then we want a starting angle of 30 and a length of 35. And this 35 is going to be measured in pixels, remember. With that, we can now set the fill color. This fill color can be whatever we really want it to be. In our case, we can make it, we can have a little bit of fun. Our first one is going to be red. So we're going to say arc1.setFill of red. Now you'll see that when I say red, in theory, this one's going to be a round archetype, which means that it's going to be taking the entire swath as though this was a circle, and you would cut out the entire area of this arc. So the entire area is going to be red. Then, as I mentioned, we have to set the type to arc1.setType of round. And the way to do that is to say arctype dot round. This is the same notation as our colors that we have up here. Then we can now add this arc, or we can add this text, the labeling text, to the pane. We're going to add the text first, then we're going to add the children, so that if for whatever reason there was an overlap, you want to make sure that the text goes on top of the original arc. So we're going to say pane, in this case pane 5, dot get children, and then we want to add a new text. This text is going to be located at 210, comma 40, and then we're going to say arc1 round. And if these numbers seem a little bit arbitrary, the reason I picked these numbers is because I know that they work. I know that they'll display cleanly without any issues. So after that, we're actually done with our first arc as long as we add it into the pane. So once we add it into the pane, we can then get started with our other arcs. This adding to the pane is going to be fairly simple, and it's just going to say pane5.getChildren.add arc1. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be fairly repetitive, so we're actually going to copy paste this. We can't use a loop because there are small variations with every single one of our arcs, but we're just going to copy paste and then modify the appropriate situation. Now, I'm actually going to keep most of this stuff standard. The center is still going to be 100, the 100 by 150 by 100, the length is still going to be 80 by 80, but the only thing we have to change here is we need to convert this 30 to a 30 plus 90. Now you could just convert this to 120, but we're not going to in the effort of readability. We're just going to leave this as 30 plus 90 to show that there is a clear pattern going on here. The reason everything else is the same is that we want this to almost look like a circle where parts of the circle were cut out. So it's very clear that this is just a modified type of circle. After that, we can now change our fills to the appropriate situation. We don't want it to be red this time. We want our fill to be white. And in this case, we are going to have an open arc. This open arc is going to be the least thick type of arc. It's just a simple line in all actuality, where everything else has just been wiped out. So we have to set the type instead of round to open. And then we can set the stroke color. In this case, we are going to. You don't have to, but we're going to in this scenario. So we're going to say arc2 dot set stroke, and then we'll provide the stroke of color dot black. This is because we have to make sure that since everything else is going to be similar, this is just a line, we should make sure that it's a black line to make it very distinct from the other types of lines, or the other types of chords and arcs we're going to have. After this, we can now modify our label. Instead of saying arc1 round, it's going to say arc2 open, obviously. And then we have to change its location. Instead of being at 21040, it's going to move down to 2040. This is because, obviously, the arc is going to move positions, and since this is going to be working counterclockwise, we have to make the text move counterclockwise as well. Then, we only need to change this to arc2, and then we're done. Once again, we can now start working with converting the third arc. The third arc is going to be fairly similar to the second arc. The only changes we're going to have to make are obviously the variable name, and we're going to have to add another 90 to the previous 90. So this is now going to be 180. And then everything else is actually going to be fairly similar, where the set fill is still going to be white, the set stroke is still going to be black, and we're still going to have a text label, and we're still going to be adding it to the pane. However, there are a couple of small changes. This time, instead of having an open type, we're going to have a chord type. This chord type, as I mentioned, is just going to outline the area that would be a chord. If you don't know what a chord is, a chord, especially in the context of a circle, is just the outside lining of where it would have been. So this is going to be an open chord that's not colored in, which is why it's marked as white. Then we need to make sure we appropriately change the label to its appropriate position. It's not going to be moving left this time. It's going to be moving down to 170. Then we have to change this from arc2 to arc3, and from open to chord. And then we're actually done here once again. So copy paste for our fourth and final arc. And now we just have to change this from 180 to 270. Change arc3 to arc4. And then we have to appropriately make sure we change our colors. Now the difference is that even though the arc type is still going to be a chord, the set stroke is still going to be black, and the location is going to be fairly similar, the only difference is this time we want to make sure we color in the center of the circle, or the center of the chord. Now a chord by default is colored in, but we made it white. We changed the fill color to white in arc3. So to make it actually colored in, to make it look colored into the human eye, we have to change it to a different color. This color could be whatever you want. In our case, we're going to make it green. And then we just have to change the appropriate positions. We have to make this into arc 4. It's still a chord, but we have to change its location. It's no longer going to be at 20, 170. If you look back, you might have noticed that arc 1 was at 210, and since this is the text fields are just going to be in a rectangle, this is now going to be at 210, 170. And then we can check back and make sure we've changed all of our arcs to the appropriate variables. And then we're actually done, because as soon as we add in the arc to the pane, we've now finished up our arcs. Even though they're all fairly repetitive, you can see when we run this program, you're going to be able to see why we had all of them, because they all demonstrate how the chords open and round differ and how you can apply them differently based on your situation. So we're going to create a new scene just as before. This is going to be called scene 5. It's equal to a new scene with the pane 5 in this case. And then we'll put it at the location of 300 by 200, which is a good size for our situation. And then finally, we have to set the title, scene, and show it back out to the user. So we're going to say stage 5, since we have gone through stages 1 through 4, so we're going to create the new stage before we start showing anything or setting titles. We're going to say stage 5 is equal to a new stage, and then we can set the title. So we're going to say stage 5 dot set title, and we can give it whatever title we want. In our case, to keep with the previous naming conventions, we're going to say show arc. Then we're going to set the scene. We're going to say stage 5 dot set scene, and then we'll provide the scene of 5, scene 5 that we have right here. And finally, we have to show this to the user by using the stage 5.show method. So with that, we can now run our program. But before we do, let's summarize what we did here. We created a new pane, then we created 4 new arcs. Each of the arcs was tailor-made to the situation. The first arc was red and a round type, meaning it'll isolate the entire region. The second one was open, so it'll just have a line, and it was black. The third one was black again, but it was a chord, but the inside was white, so it's just an outline of the chord. And the fourth arc was colored in green, and it was a chord type, so it'll have the outline and the small inside part covered in, but it won't have the entire area. You'll see what I'm talking about when we run our program. So, if we run it, you'll see what I'm talking about. With the round type, the arc colors in the entire region, as though you had taken a swath out of this pie, so to speak, or the circle, and you had just taken the entire area. With the open, it just takes the line. It just gets the area it would have covered on the circumference. With the chord, it makes a specific chord, so it goes from the point to the point that it would have ended at, makes a straight line, then takes the circumference, and colors in that area, but it's colored in white, so we can't really see it. And with the final chord, it's the same way, except it's colored in green, so we actually can see its coloring in. Hopefully you found this lesson useful. And to summarize, in today's lesson, we talked about the circle and ellipse classes, and we also talked about the arc classes and implemented them in a unique way that demonstrated their advantages. Hopefully you found this lesson useful, and hopefully you're able to implement the arc, ellipse, and circle classes in your own code.